So thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here to hear this. If greenwashing is defined as promoting a practice or a measure that is supposedly to solve an environmental problem, but in fact does not solve the problem or makes it worse, I think that is my definition of greenwashing. With the next slide, I will kind of give a summary in bullet form of what I see are the problems with RNG, why it's a false solution. So to start, RNG, renewable natural gas, fossil gas are chemically the same. RNG that's produced and burned outside of the state of Vermont counts in Vermont's renewable portfolio. RNG costs far more than fossil gas to produce. And energy sources with much lower emissions will be displaced by renewable natural gas. Finally, money spent on infrastructure and contracts for renewable natural gas could instead be spent on reducing energy use and reducing emissions. So with the next slide, I'll just go over some basic terminology. I'm guessing that all of you already know this. I'm just going to tear through this. Conventional natural gas and fracked gas are both fossil fuels. Conventional, the gas is in loose rock formation under pressure. You sink a well, it squirts out. Fracked gas, you have to put pressurized fluid into the ground to fracture the rocks that hold the gas. Fracking is considered to be more environmentally damaging. Fracked gas accounts for roughly 80% of the North American supply right now. Biogas is made from or is produced by anaerobic decomposition of organic material. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Renewable natural gas is refined from biogas into pipeline quality natural gas. Talk about what pipeline quality means in the next slide. Renewable attribute is an abstraction that identifies the renewableness of a fuel, an energy source. It can be stripped from the gas in this case and sold separately. Renewable attribute is similar but not the same as a REC, a renewable energy credit, which is used in the electric sector. So next slide. Just to be clear, natural gas is methane, it's not propane. Methane happens to be a very potent greenhouse gas. Pipeline quality gas is 96 to 98% methane. Life cycle emissions include all the emissions of greenhouse gases from production, transmission, and combustion. Next slide. So the idea here is that 15 years ago or so, during the fracking boom, the fossil fuel industry promoted the idea that natural gas would be provide a transition to a carbon-free economy. And it would do so because the fracking boom had made natural gas plentiful and cheap. This transition was going to be done without major disruption, and there'd be plenty of time for us to make the transition. Problem is that that view did not consider that methane is a far more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Over the 20-year time frame, it's roughly 86%. 86 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. 15 years or so ago, the question of life cycle emissions became an area of very active research. Robert Howarth from Cornell, among others, published papers that identified life cycle emissions due to natural gas that made it worse than other fossil fuels. So there's a new view, a new myth being promoted by the same actors, the fossil fuel companies, the policymakers, and it follows much the same script that, in this case, renewable natural gas will provide the transition to an economy that doesn't require fossil fuels. But the problem, again, is that it's chemically the same as fossil gas, although comes from a different source. But this renewable natural gas, this methane that came from organic material, is commingled in the pipeline with the fossil natural gas, and it makes up only a tiny, tiny percentage, 1% or something like that, of the gas that's transmitted by pipeline. It's still 86 times worse than CO2. And research by the community that is doing collecting data on emissions, leaks in pipelines, and so on and so forth. The production methodologies has indicated that it's possible, it's likely, in fact, that life cycle emissions for renewable natural gas are higher than for fossil gas. And on top of all of that, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has looked at the potential for all of the sources from which renewable natural gas can be produced, and they have said that that full potential being realized would produce roughly 5% of the current demand for gas. So here are 4 examples of sources of renewable natural gas, and they all happen to be in the portfolio of Vermont Gas Systems, which is the only gas utility, regulated gas utility in Vermont. So there's municipal waste treatment plants, there's compost digesters, there's landfills, large landfills, and there's manure pits at industrial scale animal farms. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the last 2 of those, landfills and industrial scale factory farms, because those are 2 potential sources of gas, and one of which is already in VGS's portfolio. So starting with landfill gas. Federal regulations require, okay, so when the organic material in the pile of trash in a landfill decomposes, it generates a stinky mess that includes roughly half methane and half CO2 and volatile organic compounds. Federal regulations require that gas, that combination, be captured by the landfill. And that's a good thing, because what it does is it prevents the methane from venting into the atmosphere, where it would be worse. It would do worse damage than carbon dioxide. So there's three options for landfill operations to dispose of the gas that they capture. The first one is the simplest, and it's the default. It's flaring, which is like, it's a big pipe, it's a big Bunsen burner. You just burn off the gas, just burn off the raw biogas, and that turns the methane into carbon dioxide. It's not a great solution, but it's better than venting the methane. And by the way, the Lebanon Municipal Landfill is doing that now, is flaring. The second option is better, and that is when you burn the biogas, you generate electricity with it on site, and then you put it into the grid. It requires minimal processing of the gas to burn, and a minimal input of energy to clean up the gas to do that. The Washington Electric Cooperative is doing that at Vermont's Sole landfill in Coventry, and they are producing roughly 2/3 of their co-op members' supply. In Lebanon, New Hampshire is going to be switching over to that option too. The third option, which is to process the biogas into renewable natural gas and put it into a pipeline, is the worst in the sense that it has the highest emissions. It requires supplementary fuel to do the cleanup because you have to remove the CO2. That's going to get vented. And you have to remove the volatile organic compounds, and you just have to do you have to do filtering and cleanup, and it takes energy. That's about as much as I know about it. Because it requires extra energy inputs, and especially because putting the methane into a pipeline causes methane releases. It's not a perfect system. And all along the route of the pipeline, there are inadvertent leaks of the methane, and some which are actually intentional. It's by design at compressor stations and vents and stuff. Let's talk about the next slide. We'll talk about relatively new development in Vermont, which is Vermont's largest source of renewable natural gas. So Vermont has, like I said, a small portfolio. About 1% of its total supply is renewable natural gas produced at the Goodrich Farm in Salisbury, Vermont. It's a tiny amount. I mean, they're pretty much maxed out. This newest development is a contract for RNG from the largest landfill in New York State. Last November, the Public Utility Commission approved a 14.5-year contract that has an option to increase the volume every year. And an option to extend for an additional 5 years. So this contract could last till 2042. That decision, by the way, is being appealed to the Vermont Supreme Court, and we can talk about that later if we're interested. So let's go to the next slide. Oops. So that was what I just talked about, and then we'll go to the next slide. So the Seneca Meadows landfill is right in the heart of the Finger Lakes region. It's the largest landfill in New York. It's owned and operated by a Texas landfill company, privately owned. It has a footprint, imagine this, a footprint of 400 acres with a pile of trash that is permitted to be 280 feet tall. It takes in 6,000 metric tons of garbage every day. And I said that it has air quality problems, and that's really kind of a vast understatement. The neighbors complain about the stench continuously. But more concerning is that the state of New York has identified a lung cancer cluster immediately around the landfill, in the residential areas around the landfill. There is massive opposition to the landfill continuing to operate. The town wants it to shut down when the state permit expires in 2025, but the company has applied for an extension of the permit and an expansion in a 15-year period that would add 47 acres of landfill liner and raise the height to the permitted height to 350 feet. So let's go to the next one. At the moment, there's a company called Archaea Energy, which is based in Houston, which runs two operations, actually. It generates RNG from raw biogas at Seneca Meadows landfill. And in addition to that, it runs biogas to electricity generators. So, as I mentioned before, the second one produces the fewest emissions per unit of energy produced. But what Archaea wants to do, what it's proposing to do, is to expand its RNG production and convert the biogas to electricity generators to run on renewable natural gas. That's going to increase the emissions per unit of energy. There's some interesting stuff going on here. The last year's Inflation Reduction Act provided incentives for development of these kinds of projects in the form of investment tax credits. So shortly after the law was passed, Archaea was bought by British Petroleum for $4 billion. Archaea currently operates 50 RNG and landfill gas-to-energy projects at facilities in the U.S., and it projects a 5-fold growth by 2030 with more than 80 new projects. So if we go to the next, you might be wondering, how does the renewable natural gas get from a landfill in upstate New York to Vermont? And in fact, it really doesn't. You can see the pin that's marked landfill. That's where the gas is produced. But where Vermont Gas Systems buys the gas is at the pin labeled Dawn Hub. Dawn Hub is this massive storage and transfer depot in southern Ontario. So the gas that is produced at the landfill is put in a pipe. Some of it, some tiny amount, may actually reach the depot at the Dawn Hub. But what's mostly being delivered to the depot at Dawn Hub is overwhelmingly fracked gas. So a tiny a fraction of a percent might be renewable natural gas arriving there. At any rate, from the Dawn Hub, the gas that Vermont Gas Systems has purchased, along with the renewable attributes associated with production at the landfill, that makes its way up to above Toronto, where it's put onto the Trans-Canada pipeline, and it finally makes its way to the Vermont Gas System at its entry point at the Quebec border. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that VGS in their program manual acknowledges exactly that. Although out-of-state VGS renewable natural gas resources may not physically flow to the VGS system, the environmental attributes will be dedicated to Vermont gas customers. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the interesting thing about emissions for biofuels and other measures of reducing emissions is that they're computed using numerical models, and there's a lot of different types of models. The one that seems to that California uses and Vermont is likely to use is a model created by the Argonne National Laboratory. That's the model. Okay, so what it computes is essentially a life cycle emissions factor for from well to burner tip emissions in the form of a carbon intensity, which is basically mass of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of energy. And carbon dioxide equivalent indicates that a gas like methane will be given a value considerably higher than the same energy value of carbon dioxide. I didn't say that very well, but I'll keep going. Okay, so based on the modeling that was done, the run of the model that was done by the California Air Resources Board, VGS claims that the gas produced at the RNG produced at Seneca Meadows has a life cycle emissions of roughly half that of fossil gas. However, Professor Howarth from Cornell, who I mentioned earlier, testified back in February to the Senate Natural Resources Committee when they were taking up the Affordable Heat Act that RNG has no greenhouse gas benefit and may cause greater emissions than fossil fuel. And I just want to take a moment here to introduce Professor Howarth. He is one of the most widely cited environmental scientists in the world. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers. He's been cited in tens of thousands of times in other peer-reviewed papers. He has given a briefing at the White House. He's testified before the U.S. Congress. He's testified to the Canadian Parliament. He's testified to the EU Parliament, the Irish Parliament, to the New York Assembly. And in February, he testified to the Vermont Senate, and his testimony was ignored, basically ignored. How the PUC decided its case last December. First of all, it found that it's irrelevant that out-of-state gas doesn't reach Vermont. They say, it's reducing emissions somewhere. Somebody's burning it. They didn't actually address whether or not there might be double counting in another jurisdiction. But they also explicitly found that it was sufficient for VGS to provide evidence that the carbon intensity was lower than fossil gas. It didn't require them to make any comparisons to other measures that could have been taken even at a lower cost. So what I'm going to talk about in the next slide is the other proposed major source of RNG. This one produced in Vermont at what I'm referring to as a factory farm in which is industrial scale farm, 4,000 cows, called Pleasant Valley Farms in Berkshire, Vermont. So one of the things that characterizes industrial scale farms, animal farms, is that they have liquid manure management, and that's got undoubtedly lots of advantages for a massive, huge number of animals. But it also maximizes the methane production at the farm compared to other management practices for manure. The project will be owned, so it's located on this farm, Pleasant Valley Farms, but the RNG project will be owned and operated by the company that is the applicant for a certificate of public good with a Public Utility Commission. It's a company called Bellevue RNG that was formed just for this project on this farm, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary of an outfit called Novilla Investment Holdings LLC, which is located in Michigan. VGS will build and own an 8-mile distribution pipeline to connect it to its main transmission line in Enosburg. The pipeline will have 24 stream crossings, but Bellevue says that the flood hazard rules don't apply. Okay. Unlike landfills, dairy farms aren't required to capture the methane that is produced in their manure lagoons. So there's nothing other than capturing it for profit that prevents the gas the methane from being vented to the atmosphere. This project is proposed to replace, this RNG generation project would replace the on-site biogas fueled electric generation with RNG generation. So again, the replacement will increase emissions per unit of energy generated, but it's going to generate a lot more revenue, both for the project, who will be paying, I'm sure, a handsome fee to the farm, and it's going to be providing RNG to Vermont gas systems. Now, RNG, so these models that I was mentioning before talk about the carbon intensity, basically the emissions factor. The RNG for this project is being claimed to be a negative number, which sounds crazy. It basically means that burning this RNG is better for the climate than burning nothing at all. The rationale for that, of course, is that you're capturing gas that would otherwise have been vented into the atmosphere, and you're turning it into, you're basically, you're preventing a release, and you're generating fuel. The flaw, of course, in this reasoning is that they're replacing something that already captures the gas and turns it into energy, but at a cost both in higher emissions and higher costs, higher monetary costs. Right. Pleasant Valley Farms is not a green operation. So this is a partial list of the violations or the warnings that the farm has been cited, which I got out of the public record, VT Digger in 7 days and filings in Superior Court. So 2011, 2015, warnings from the state and the FDA about drug residues found in milk. 2016, an illegal discharge of agricultural waste into a stream that drains into Missisquoi Bay, which is heavily polluted part of Lake Champlain. There was commentary in VT Digger in 2019 that reported hideous migrant worker living quarters and leaking manure lagoons. 3 years ago, the state sued the farm for multiple violations, including illegally constructing a 10 million gallon manure pit without a permit. So this is where the so-called green energy is coming from in Vermont. The PUC has not yet issued a decision on this case. So let's talk about the Affordable Heat Act, passed last year, established the clean heat standard, and it set some requirements. It set a lot of requirements, but I'm just going to go through these, which are most relevant to what I'm going to have to say. First of all, the fuel dealers, the so-called obligated parties, have to generate or buy clean heat credits, which are generated or which are created by certain measures that a fuel dealer or an installer will take. So if an installer installs a heat pump, that would generate clean heat credits, and those clean heat credits could be bought by by a fuel dealer to meet its obligation under the clean heat standard. Credits for biofuels will depend on the life cycle emission factors generated by the model, probably the GREET model. So there's the possibility that a dairy operation can generate negative emissions, which would be relatively astronomical level of credit compared to landfill gas, for example. Pipeline RNG gets special attention, special treatment in this bill. And this is probably a good place to point out that the clean heat standard was developed basically, well, certainly with Vermont gas systems at the table, but there seems to be enough evidence from video presentations done by the former and current CEO of VGS that it was actually birthed at Vermont Gas Systems, the clean heat standard. The law makes the Public Utility Commission responsible for the standards, the clean heat standards implementation details, by writing rules, which they are in the process of doing right now. So it would be interesting at this point to look at what decisions the PUC has already made regarding, for example, renewable natural gas, which might give us some clue as to what these rules might give us. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of fussy, but on the left-hand column is some language from a VGS contract with a waste treatment facility in Dubuque, Iowa that generates renewable natural gas. And there's a third-party certification as part of the contract that describes the physical pathway of the pipeline systems between the injection point at the facility and the point of injection at the VGS end. The Affordable Heat Act has, okay, so starting at the top, it says that renewable natural gas and other renewable gas substitutes, the utility has to purchase the gas and its renewable attributes, and then it uses language very similar to what's already in a VGS contract. About physical delivery, contractual pathway. So go to the next slide and we can see how the Public Utility Commission addressed that contract language. It said, quote, "The out-of-state RNG need not and may never enter the VGS pipeline. The out-of-state RNG will enter a pipeline system to be used by others, with VGS being credited for the RNG attributes." Okay, so next slide. I mean, I'm pretty much, this is the end of what I have to say, but because everybody wants to know what's going to happen next. So keep an eye on this appeal on the Seneca Meadows contract. It's being appealed to the Vermont Supreme Court. So this would be a good point at which to say that Catherine Bach is a 75-year-old VGS ratepayer who lives in an apartment in Burlington and took on the opposition to this contract at the Public Utility Commission without a lawyer, and made a case that's strong enough to be appealed. It's also worth noting that in most other states, there's a ratepayer advocate, an independent advocate who takes on these sorts of cases and does the work that this citizen had to do on her own with her own resources. Vermont is the only state in New England that lacks an independent ratepayer advocate, and it's one of only about 8 states in the entire country that doesn't have one. It's got an office under the Public Service Department called the Public Advocate, but it's not an independent office. In, for example, New Hampshire, it's a political appointment, but once the advocate is appointed, he or she cannot be removed without cause and without a hearing. Anyhow, since Chris has not told me I'm running out of time, I thought I'd throw that in. Keep an eye on the PUC's decision on this factory farm digester up in Berkshire. It's likely to happen sometime later this year. That'll be a big deal. One thing I haven't mentioned, well, I did mention the Inflation Reduction Act established investment tax credits. There are 14 other dairy operations in Vermont that are turning biogas into energy. Only one of them, the one in Salisbury, is turning it into RNG. And that's a much smaller farm. There are 10 farms larger than that that are operating, 9 farms larger than that are operating the biogas to electricity operation. I would assume that they might all be interested in this investment tax credit and the revenue stream that will flow from it. And then the third thing to keep an eye on is the Clean Heat Standard implementation. The PUC has got 2 dockets open, one for writing rules, and they're asking for comments now, and people have been making comments, and I made a comment. And, we'll see where that goes. Okay, and then in summary, the next slide, which is actually identical to my opening slide. The problems with RNG is that it's chemically identical to fossil gas. It's produced, when it's produced and burned out of state, it's still can count in Vermont's renewable portfolio. It costs a lot more to produce. I don't think I mentioned this, but it's kind of hard to pin down the numbers. 5 to 7 times more expensive than fossil gas. And renewable natural gas will and does displace energy sources that have much lower emissions than RNG. And finally, and this is a big one, the dollars that are being spent in these investments, which are being recovered from ratepayers, those dollars could instead be spent on measures that actually reduce energy and emissions. So that's it. That's all I have to say.